Awesome. Awesome. Yeah. So, hello, everyone. Welcome to, this is going to be, we're going to say, I was telling Vicky and Karen that I put together these slides. It's a lot of information, but I wanted to hit at the surface level of a lot of different things on how to structure a lecture course. Um, and we're going to see how the order works. We're going to see how this goes. So just a little bit about me, right? So I'm an associate teaching professor at Rice University. I have been here, I've been teaching now for 11 years, but prior to that, I was actually a trainee twice with the GCC, right? So I did my graduate work at Rice, and there I was part of HAMPI, the Houston Area Molecular Biophysics training program. And then did my postdoc at Baylor for 10 years, and there I was part of the pharmacoinformatics, which was actually, it was right out of the UT Health. And so I'm very familiar with this organization and the medical center. Been here for a long, long time. So yeah, go Hampy. Yeah, it's a great program. It's been around for a long time. So that's kind of my background, right? And for many of you, you're probably in the same kind of position that I was, right? That when I was a grad student, I was like, hey, I think I want to do this. I think I want to keep going into research and be a PI and have a research lab. And that was even true as I started my postdoc. But a couple years into my postdoc, for a variety of reasons, one being the downturn in the economy, so that was 2007-ish, and getting a grant was really hard at that time, but also just some other aspects. I was like, I'm not sure I really want to be that professor that runs a lab. Right. And so I started thinking about what are those alternative careers. And the one thing that I always enjoyed was mentoring at the bench. I loved interacting with students and teaching. That just seemed to be my bread and butter. And so uh, I'm not going to talk about a lot of that today, and this is like what are the things that I did. But I'm happy to have those conversations, right? As you reach out to me, I'm happy to have those conversations on what are the different kinds of things that I did as a postdoc that allowed me to get some teaching experience. That when the job opened here at Rice, now granted it was from the same my home department that I got my PhD in, so I was like coming home, right? So it was a special situation in that sense, but I still was able to talk the talk. I was still able to show here are things that I bring to the table. All right, so I'm going to share my PowerPoint, and then I'm going to make sure I put it in full mode here in just a second. There we go. All right, y'all can see my slides, I think. Yeah, okay. And then I'm going to also, the fun things with technology, I need to see the chat also because I'm going to ask for some responses here and every now and then. And so I need to be able to see what folks are saying. Okay. All right. So, kind of as I put in the kind of like the abstract, right, or what this talk would be about, right? It's like, okay, it's your big day, right? You're going to give, oops, get this to advance. There we go. Right, it's your big day. You're going to give that lecture, right? What do you need to think about? Right? Because there's a lot to this. There's a lot of things that depending on the type of class, depending on if you're trying to, develop this from scratch, if you're just subbing for, a day or two, because different classes, right, may be taught by different professors. There's a lot of things you want to think about. And so what I want to talk about today is, right, our learning goal is to understand how to structure a class lecture. And the learning objectives for today, right? I want you to think about what's the difference between instructor-centered versus student-centered learning. We're going to talk about a fantastic book that's now 27 years old, but it's a great book called How People Learn. We're going to talk about how that book, as well as some other more recent findings, help us think about learning and the assessments that we use. What are assessments? How we think about Bloom's taxonomy. And then, as you'll see throughout this talk, I'm going to be throwing out a variety of terms. Sometimes I'll define them, sometimes I won't. So I encourage you to write down when you hear a term, right? Write that down because learning that lingo and knowing what to even just look up, right, is helpful. All right. So, right, think back to your favorite professor, right, in college, right? What do you think made them effective? So in the chat, right, write one or two words. How would you describe that individual? Mhm. And engaging, open to conversation, enthusiastic, the style of delivery, friendly, can explain things, enthusiastic, interested, understood the student goals, patient, can teach different ways, extra effort. Yeah, right. All of those things, right? And so what I will tell you is that that's what you want to also do, right? I didn't have any formal training in the sense that, right, and in many respects, right? There's this aspect of like being a college professor where it's like because you have a PhD, you can teach, right? Like they hire you, and it's like that's not true, right? I fell back initially on like my original kind of the ways that I was taught and found out that there were a lot of things that I did that really weren't that effective. Right. And so wanting to think about all those things, right? All of those characteristics that you just described about that professor, right? The biggest thing is you're going to deal with these kinds of challenges, right? When you walk into the classroom, you're going to have various students who, you know, they're what do you call it? They have these busy lives, right? Your class is not their only thing. They have so many other things going on in college, and so you're going to get that disgruntled or, not enthusiastic student, the student who wants to answer everything, dealing with, people who might be, distracted, right? They're who knows what these two women are looking at on the computer, right? They may be actually looking at the lecture, they may be watching a video, right? Or sleepy eyes, as we call it, right? And how we deal with each of these challenges. And and part of this is because what we're going to be asking students to do, right? Why they resist learning and specifically student-centered learning is because it's hard, right? It is really hard. I love this Calvin and Hobbes cartoon, right? Where right Calvin's asking, right, that he wants to get that great job, right? And realizes that, he's got to put a lot of effort to do it, right? So he forgets it, right? Don't want to do that, right? And so the one of the kind of the mantras that you want to remember is that the one, right, by Terry Dole here, right? The one who does the work does the learning. Right. I think back even to your own, like even just research, right? In many respects, I'm going to tie this into what you do in the on the daily routine in the lab, right? You learn by doing things, right? We learn better in many respects by applying what we know, right? In context. And and so, but it's hard, right? It is learning is very hard. And so one of the main things that you need to do with your students, particularly at the beginning, is you got to establish trust. Trust is a big thing, right? You're going to ask them, you may be asking them to do things that they're not familiar with. They're going to be asked to, ask questions or answer things in front of their peers, right? Which can be a scary thing because they don't want to be wrong, right? They don't want to say something that might seem dumb or silly. And so having that welcoming environment, right? That engaging environment where, it's okay not to know, right? It's okay to have an opinion. It's okay to to say whatever is on your mind, right? What you think the answer might be, and that there's no judgment on what that answer is, right? So establishing that trust, right? So being transparent, right? Being explicit up front. So I do this on day one in my class, right? Here's what we're going to be doing. Here is, right, we're going to do activities, right? And today, guess what, guys? We're going to do activities, right? I'm going to have you do things because, again, the one who does the work does the learning, right? Be open, be transparent, right? It does not water things down at all to tell them, today we are going to do the following. We're going to learn about the following. You're not giving away anything, right? Because learning is still hard, right? Varying those teaching methods, right? You don't necessarily want to do the same thing every day. Because then it becomes kind of predictable in a way that then they stop paying attention. right? They get desensitized, right, to certain aspects. So changing things up. And lecturing sometimes, right? You're not going to hear me to say that lecturing's bad, right? Lecturing is important. It's just that you don't necessarily want to be lecturing all the time, right? That there are ways to get across the same content and to help your students learn by varying, again, these different activities, right? And as I say, you start on day one, right? You set those expectations, right? So on day one, I'm walking around the room in my class, right? I'm asking questions. I'm engaging those students, right? If I know their names, I'm calling their names, right? I'm going to set up activities that they're going to do throughout the semester, so that they see it, right? And particularly, I'll say like in the introduction week, or call it syllabus day, that day one. I have examples of things that they will do, right? So there are like I show a previous work by a student and have them like help me assess this, right? Here's the rubric that I use to assess. What do you think the student did well? Where do you think they can improve? Right? Because I'm going to use the exact same rubric on them, right? That's at full transparency, right? Students should understand what my expectations are. All right. And again, that doesn't water it down. That's being transparent. They should know what is coming, right? And what my expectations are so that they are able to, in the moment, gauge their own learning, right? And how they're doing. And so as we think about sort of the traditional, right, what I know that I experienced many times in college, right, is the transmissionist, right? The passive person is standing in the front of the room and they're just talking, right? And I'm just there writing down things that I think might be important, right? Trying to glean out what might be important, right? Is this going to be on the exam, right? Am I going to have to know this later? Versus what I want to encourage is that engagement where we have the students being the ones who are doing the critical thinking and interacting with each other and you, right? But that they're the ones who are doing the work. Right. Another book I want to recommend, right, is Helping Students Learn, right? And so when we switch these roles, right, where I'm there, but I'm facilitating in many respects, right, and helping the students learn and gauge their own learning, right, that there are these roles that they do, right? And you can see a variety of things, right? They're learning how to do new things, they're engaging in reflection. We're going to talk more about that today, right? They're practicing, right? They're doing the homework, right? But they're engaged in doing things. And there's this idea of that desirable difficulties. Again, that learning is hard, right? But that it's worth it, right? That I tell my students about how um, it may not make sense right now, right? Like we're going to do something today, and it may not seem like it's important today, but it's going to be important in the next class, or it might be important later in the semester, or it may be important for the next course that they're taking, or even after they graduate, right? That there are things that they're going to be doing, right? There's no busy work. I don't like busy work. I think it's silly. I think I can do all the things that I want my students to do in class, whether they realize it or not, right? And that, again, being transparent that it is difficult. It can be difficult, but it's desirable, right? And that they're going to learn and that they're going to learn it better. They're going to retain that content better and be able to apply it. Right. And so, scientifically, right, when we are engaged, right, if you're just listening, like right now, you're just listening to me. So, you might only have a few centers lit up, right? But later, right, in a few minutes, right, those more centers in your brain are gonna light up, right? Those neurons are firing, right? And in learning, we know this where as we look at the number of connections, right, those neural networks, right, that as we age, as we learn things, right, we have lots of we can think about it from this sort of biological side, right? But we are complex beings, right? We learn from our experiences, right? And sort of this general idea of learning is, right, we get some sort of input, we try to figure out, right, we can move it into long-term memory, we can store it, right? That strengthens those neurons, those connections, right? And then be able to retrieve it. And sometimes things don't go into long-term memory. right? Sometimes it is the short term, and part of that is that short term being it's in class, right? It's in this next 5 minutes that we're going to talk about something, and I need to figure out ways that help the students get it into long-term memory, right? And so thinking about how we do that, right? I've touched upon this a little bit already in that it's deliberate practice, right? I'm going to design activities in my class so that the students explicitly practice the things that I want them to know. Again, no busy work, right? I want them to know these different things because we're going to use them, right? We're either going to use them later today, maybe next week, later the semester, right? Or it's in the next class, right? My class that I teach at Rice is a freshman level class that acts as a bridge course between AP biology and our advanced lectures like biochemistry and genetics and cell biology. So I'm biochem and cell biology light. And so I hit the surface on many topics so that we start to build that framework of understanding, but I also let them know you're going to learn more, you know, from this concept, right? Biochemistry is going to go into more detail right here, right? And again, so it's that deliberate practice, those things that I want them to know, right? Edward Wills, this I like one of these quotes, right? You teach me, I forget. You show me, I remember. You involve me, I understand. Again, that active learning. Because even after 2 weeks, right? If we just read it, we'll forget it. Hear it, see it, right? It's this bottom part, right? The 70 to 90%, right? We retain more, right? Those things that were in our short-term memory get consolidated into our long-term memory when we are saying them and we're doing them. The other thing that you want to keep in mind is the idea of specificity of training. The idea there is that that's at the same cognitive level. There is this concept in that I tell my students, and you may have experienced this in class, where you're listening, you got, you go through this lecture, say you think biochemistry, cell biology, something like that, right? And you feel like you understood everything well, you took notes, and then you get to that exam, and the professor is asking you about something that is so obscure that was on slide 40 in the corner that he didn't even touch, right? He didn't even talk about. He spent 10 minutes on this other thing, and that's not to be found anywhere on the exam, right? And it seems unfair, right? And I think that's a disservice, right? So when I talk about here about the same cognitive level, right, what I'm referring to is Bloom's, right? This idea that in high school we're asked to know and to comprehend, to understand, right? And in college, it is these higher level cognitive skills, right? Being able to take this knowledge, right, and to be able to apply it, to be able to break it down, right, to analyze, to create something new, to see, a different version of data, right, and evaluate, right? What does it mean, right? And so thinking about these different verbs, right? And I'm going to show an example of this later of how I do this in my class, where part of those learning objectives, right? If you go back to that slide where I gave you the learning objectives, I'm using these specific verbs, right? I'm letting my students know, hey, if I only want you to list something, then that's what I should be asking you on the exam, right? I shouldn't be asking you to now compare it, right? Or defend something, right? Because that's a higher level than just simply listing a term, right? So being fair to your students, again, that's part of building that trust. I'm going to say I'm going to do things. I'm being transparent about it. And that builds that trust with your students because now they're engaged. They know what to expect. They're also going to ask things. They're going to interact more with you and they're going to ask those questions, right? And again, I'm not watering down anything, right? I'm going to also ask them some harder questions, right? I'm going to ask them to do higher level skills, right? But I'm going to be transparent about it. And I have this is my little owl, and I haven't since my screen is. Let me see if I can do this. Can I do this? I'm going to try something here. If I lose you, I will be back. I was going to put in. There we go. Okay, I figured it out. I have a PDF. I'm going to drop it in chat. This is my favorite one because we are the Rice Owls. So that is just a taxonomy. It's just a different version, right, of the different verbs here, right? The different levels of the of Bloom's level. All right. So thinking about how people learn, right? Like I said, it was done by the National Research Council in 1999. They had three main findings. They make an effective learning environment, and that is helping students to address their misconceptions, building both a factual network as well as a conceptual framework, and then helping students monitor their own learning. And so with that first one is how do we address student misconceptions, right? Because students come in with all kinds of information, and it's even more challenging now because everything's right here, right? Everything's on their phone. We now have AI, right? This is ChatGPT's logo, right? This is now a new challenge for us in that everything is right there, right? And not all of it is correct, of course, right? And so how is it that we can help students figure out what is it that they know, right? That is, I'll call it correct versus incomplete versus wrong. Right. And so to demonstrate that, this is where I need your pen and paper. I'd like you to draw. I'm going to give you about 30 seconds here. I'd like you to draw Earth's orbit around the sun, viewing from above the plane of that orbit. And then on your image, where should the Earth be during summer and winter if you're thinking about the northern hemisphere? I'm going to give you 30 seconds to jot something down. All right. I'm actually going to stop my share here so we can see. I'm going to ask so folks if you're willing turn your camera on and show me what you got and see if we can. It's going to be kind of fun. I know this is a challenge. This is going to be one of those things. I'll see how this is going to work. This may not work well.
Nothing, I get.
Let me see we can see some things there. Okay. All right. I'm seeing it. Yeah, I see Eliza. Yeah. Cool. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Megan. Thank you. Yeah. Yep. I see yours, Eliza. Yep. Yeah. Got it. It's ovalish. Yep. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for showing.
Nothing.
That's okay. That's okay. It's hard. You didn't know that you were going to get this question, huh? Yeah. And so let me make sure I choose the right screen. I think it's this one. Yes. Okay. All right. So what I saw, right, for many of the diagrams, right, was something like this, right? Kind of ovalish, right? Right in the you may or may not know this, right? The in the northern hemisphere, or when we think about the northern hemisphere, our summer is actually the furthest away. Earth is as far away as it can be, and our winter we're actually the closest, which is kind of fun to think about how hot it gets here in Houston, because that doesn't make any sense, right? But here's the different things. But this is actually not correct, right? We draw this, and there's a reason we draw it this way, but when we actually think about the true orbit, right? There's this idea of eccentricity, right? Which is how close to circular it is, and that's actually how close it is. Its value 0.017, like it's practically a circle, right? We know it's not, right? But it is practically a circle. So some of you may be thinking like, wait a minute, did they just teach me wrong? Right? Were they lying to me? Right? And part of this is we do things, particularly I'll say at the lower levels, right, in elementary school and in high school, where we're telling them enough information to get and we may tell them in a point to get across a point, right, when it actually may not be completely factual, right? When you look at, this, if I go back here, right? I've got the distances here. It's only 5 million, kilometers, right? What's 5 million among friends, right? But it is practically a circle, right? And so we draw this because it does get across the point, right? That our orbit isn't perfect, that right, because of these differences, we do have our seasons, right? And going into all of those, if this was, what this lecture was about. But it is a misconception, right? It is factually not true to be this way. And so your students come in, right, with that prior knowledge, and it can both help as well as hinder learning, right? Depending on the context, right? That, as you are describing things, as you're talking about information, right, their understandings are what they are going to build upon. And if they're coming in with the wrong idea, that's going to make it harder, right? And so helping students figure out, right, what is the framework that they should work with, right? And again, that's our challenge. And everyone's different, right? If I polled everyone that's in this Zoom call, right, I'm going to get different answers, and that is a challenge, right? As we think about, the classroom as a whole, right? And again, this idea with the prior knowledge, right, that we're going to get to this point where things may not agree, and we're trying to construct this new knowledge, right? We all have this understanding, this framework, right? As we go into um, our own understanding, right? I'm going to say something, right? This is how you think the world works, and you're trying to figure out how does this fit into your understanding, right? Knowledge isn't just created; it's built upon what you know, right, and what you've experienced, right? And if it challenges what you know and understand, right, that is where you have to decide, well, do I believe that, right, or do I not, right? How do you reconcile that, right? And in reconciling how that new information, um, how it works with your framework, right? You're building a new model, right? And again, if you trust what I'm saying, right? Again, if I'm building that trust with my students, then and I make it where, again, the environment, it's okay to be wrong, right? It's okay that you don't know this yet, right? That is more welcoming and again allows your students to engage more with the material rather than physics is just hard. I'm never going to get this, right? I was that way. I feel that way still sometimes, right? Physics, why did I have to take physics, right? But I did, right? And we all did, right? And it's not going to be true for every subject, right? But you would hope that with the students who come to your class, right, that they want to learn what it is that topic is, and that you engage them, right? Because then they're going to want to learn more, right, as you help them in this process. So that key finding number two, right, helping them build that factual knowledge and conceptual framework, right? So both of those, not only knowing the fact, right, but what it means, right? And how everyone thinks about, you know, their learning and how their own framework, right? We're all different in that, and how we also apply it is different, right? And so you're the expert, right? You're the expert, you're the one that's teaching things, and so you have that information and you know what to do with it, right? And we're trying to help our students develop that, right, with different kinds of activities. And so that value of a conceptual framework. And so this is a classic example where it's called the chessboard challenge, where for those of you who may play chess, you may look at this. There are 22 pieces on the board, and you can see if you play chess, you know that all of these pieces are in the correct place, right? So could you correctly place those, right? If I asked everyone in here, right? Some folks who play chess, you're able to place them. Those of you who've never looked at a chessboard, right? It's going to be harder, right? Experts have the advantage because we know the framework. We know where things are. We understand the rules, right? And so when they've shown a board, right, to either chess masters or class A chess players, right, or beginners, right, it takes the beginners a lot longer, many more trials to place all those pieces where they need to be, right? Because again, they're trying to learn the rules. Your students are no different, right? They're trying to understand the rules of, again, whatever the concept is, right? If we're thinking about something in cell biology, right? And you're thinking about, a signaling map kinase pathway, right? They're just trying to figure out what are all these pieces, who interacts with who, right? And again, for you who may do this on a daily basis, right? It's easy, right? But that beginner, it takes them longer. But if we break it, right? These pieces are now not where they should be, right? Then experts are no different than beginners, right? I've broken the framework, right? I've broken the rules. If I start talking about how the nucleus is outside the cell, right? Like that doesn't make any sense. Right? Your students are going to be confused. You're going to be confused, right? Like it doesn't make any sense. So you want to think about what that framework is for different, what your topic is, right? And I'm going to use that as an example here. Okay. All right. I'm going to show you a bunch of terms. I want you to try to remember as many of you can in 30 seconds. All right. In the chat, don't tell me the words, but how many do you feel like you remember? How many, if you had to write them down right now, give me a number. Okay. Right. About half-ish, six, three, eight, seven. Yeah. Right. Right. I saw 12, so that's someone's got a good way of maybe organizing things, right? Five, six, seven. Yeah. Right. It's kind of hard, right? Because those words kind of seem, I'm gonna show them again. They kind of seem random, right? I'll let you look at them for just a second here, right? But wouldn't it be easier if you knew, right, the conceptual framework, right? Those could have been terms about like those could have been different, proteins in a pathway or different genes, right? Or different um, organs in an animal, right? There, but again, if it doesn't, horses in a Kentucky Derby, there you go, right? Like it does. It seems like that, right? It's just like, what's going on here, right? But if it was easy, like if you knew the conceptual framework, it would be easier, right? So I'm going to show you to again, I'm going to show them to you again, but I'm going to show you, I'm going to let you, I imagine you're going to get the framework as soon as you see them, right? I'm going to give you 30 seconds as you look at them. All right. How about now? What's the number? All right. Probably all 15. Yeah, 12. Yeah. I'll say compare, right? Compare this number to what it was the first time, right? It does count up to 15. Yeah. Right. It's right. You see that framework, right? The framework, right? Is I can go back, right? Just so we can see here, right? Right. We're going the dollar bill is a one. There's two dice, three, four, five fingers, six, right? We're counting all the way to 15, right? With different, common conventions for some of these, right? And so the same thing is true, right, for your students, right? That things that seem fairly random, right? They totally make sense to you, right? Because you're an expert. You notice those patterns. You know how things connect. And so helping your students, right? It's partly just how do you present, right? You're getting the same right? I didn't change the words. You're getting the same content, but I'm presenting it now in a way to help you see a framework that you can work with. right? To help you remember that information, right? Because as an expert, you have that information and you have a deeper understanding of that, but you also now know that you can, because you have that information, you can do those higher level Bloom's taxonomy, right? You can now apply it, right? You can retrieve that information quite easily, right? Think about your research, right, in the lab. You're the expert. I have no doubt that every one of you would teach me something fairly quickly, right? Because there's so much out there in science, right? That I know I don't know it all. And but you do. You know exactly your niche and what you're studying, right? And because you've dove into that, right? So the same thing is with your students, right? Is helping them know what that framework is so that they become those experts, right, in this knowledge. All right. The third key finding is enhancing our students' ability to monitor this, right? They're going to be doing things in the class, right? But how is it that they are able to know that they're actually learning, right? And this is idea of metacognition, right? Thinking about thinking, learning how we learn, right? This kind of philosophical kind of questions of how do we know what we know, right? How do you know, right? You know something. How do you know that you know it, right? What is that? What is the way that gives you confidence that, yeah, this piece of information, I know this, right? Part of it is it works in your framework, right? You can justify it through a number of different means. Part of it is you can teach it to someone, right? You can tell someone else about it, right? And not only is it that you can teach it, but you are helping them understand it using their terms, their framework, right? Not yours. You're using their framework and you're able to get across that same idea, right? And that is again the challenge because you have a sea of frameworks to work with, right? There's everyone here again in this Zoom, right? We all have different frameworks on a given topic, right? And that is your challenge, right? To make things as effective as we can for as many of the students, right? And thinking about what are the different ways that we can do that. So there is this general memory model, right? Of the longer something is in short-term memory, that it will go to the long term, right? That it's more likely to transmit into long term. So helping students think about it's not simply about just reading over and over again, because there's plenty of studies that show just reading over and over and over again a passage does not work, right? But there is data about that rehearsal aspect and thinking about the information in multiple ways. And again, doing activities, right? Doing the work that help it move into long term so that we can organize, right? We have opportunity and time to organize the information, figure out how it connects to everything else that we may know, and that it's not just sort of random, right? We reduce that arbitrary nature of information so that we are learning, their students are learning, they retain it, right, they can bring it back, right? That I can ask them later, right? And so there's this aspect of ask, don't tell, right? And I do realize that today I have been doing a lot of telling. It's a little hard in Zoom to have lots of conversations, right? You can think about like within Zoom, if you had an online class, right, breaking out into smaller groups in the breakout rooms, right, where you can have more of those conversations. Obviously, in person, there are lots of other ways, right, where with the way the freight, where with the setup is, right, to have more conversation, right, with your students. Because part of it is also I call it right that the body language, right? I see a bunch of names on a screen, right? I don't know what's going on if you're confused right now, if you're engaged, right? I can't tell that, right? But you can in person, right? And so that does make it a little challenging, right? Always in Zoom. But the remembering that the person doing the talking, right, the one who's doing the work is doing the learning, right? Because I'm having to think about things as I'm talking, right? As I'm explaining, right? So to help our students, right? Again, is how do we know that we know something to then help our students know when they know something? How can we help them monitor their own learning and their own understanding? right? I'm going to talk about different activities, right? And of course, the key is before the exam, right? If that is the assessment, right? That they have all this knowledge, and if that's how I'm going to ask them to provide that information back to me, right? How is it that they can in the process, right, know what they know and know that they are understanding things in a good way. All right. And so I have a scenario for you, and Vicky's going to put up a poll here in just a second. But here is an a thought for you, right? You have three students here, Kathy, Tristan, and Michael, and they all studied the same amount of time practicing a math test, right? They all did 6 hours. Kathy does an hour one day, or sorry, 1 hour the 6 days leading up to the exam, right? The exam's on Friday. Tristan does it every other day for 2 hours, and Michael crams 6 hours the night before. All right. All right, Vicky, give us that poll there. All right. I want you to uh let me get Vicky to put the poll up for us if we can. Okay. There we go. Because I can't see it. So um I'm hoping y'all get it right. So who earns the best grade in this scenario? Is it Kathy, Tristan, or Michael? I'm gonna let Vicky give me the result here.
Going to give a few more seconds for some people to answer.
Sure.
People are still contemplating. Some people are
Yep.
putting it also in the chat if they're not seeing the poll.
Yeah. Trying to think. So I may say if you don't see the poll, go ahead and put in the chat, and I'll just start counting. I'm seeing a lot of Kathys. Click on more and click on poll. Okay.
Okay, we're getting a few more
Oh, I
responses.
see the poll now. I see it. Cool. I see it. It is on more. Got it. Got it. Got it. Got it. Got it. Okay. Cool. I'm learning here. See, I'm learning too. There we go. Vicky's teaching us. This is great. Okay. So got a couple Tristans in here. No one's choosing Michael, huh?
Got a couple, there's one person that has chosen Michael so far in the poll.
Awesome. All right. Go, Michael. Yeah.
Okay,
Okay.
so I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and share the results.
There we go. Okay. So Kathy or Tristan is in the lead there. Michael. Yeah. Great. That's awesome. So in this particular scenario, it's actually a toss-up, right? Cramming actually works. We've all done it in the short term, right? If I needed you to memorize those 15 terms, right, that I showed earlier, and I asked you in 30 minutes to give it back to me, right? I imagine most of you would be able to do those 15 terms, right? Because you will have crammed. You will have thought about it and figured out ways to retain that information in the short term. Right. And someone said this in chat, right? All but only Kathy retains in long-term memory. And that is the key, right? That if I asked you 2 weeks from now, can you give me those or a month from now? Right. Right. As we think about exams, right? Because I'm going to go over several lectures right before that exam. Right. So you got to be figuring out how to get this information, retain it because you're going to use it. I'm going to ask you about it, right? Several weeks from now. Right. Kathy is who's going to retain or who's going to do better, right, on this exam, likely right on average, right, as we look at this. And so being exposed, right, so again, it's that idea about that short-term memory, right, being exposed to information, right, but keeping it there longer, right, allows for that again longer term retention, gives opportunity for Kathy to let things percolate, right? Mull things over, right? And so that when it does come time for exam, right, she's going to be the top scorer, right, among these three students, right? In a similar way, there is this aspect of what's called the testing effect. And again, it's this idea, right? So S is study, T is test, right? Again, that if I ask you to just study, 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 study 4 times in a row, right, you're going to retain that information. In fact, everyone does fairly well. right? But the idea of testing, that is actually, you know, um, forgetting the curb of about true, true. Yeah, there's a lot of things I can't get into right now because I only short on certain things. Um, but the idea, right, that if I study, but if I test myself, right, testing is by asking questions, right? Again, asking, don't tell, right? If I ask questions, having students tell me, I'm asking you to retrieve the information, right? The more you can test yourself, the more that your students can test themselves on information, the better it's going to be for retention later, right? I tell my students this right on day one that I encourage questions, right? And I imagine you would do the same in the sense that, right, you want questions. It's not fun just talking and getting crickets, right? You want questions. You want, and I tell them, right, no question is silly, no question is dumb, right? I encourage that. I tell them I've never had a student ask too many questions, right? That is not a challenge, right? It's just my sincere way of asking a question, right? I want them to ask because questions provide opportunities for everyone to retrieve information, right? Students feel often, right? And you may have felt this way at some point, right? That you're the only one in the room who doesn't know this answer, right? Everyone else is getting it. You're the only one. And so you don't want to ask. And we know that's not true, right? That, um, you're going to ask and your peers are going to thank you for it, right? That they're going to thank you for it because there's going to be others in the room who didn't want to ask or didn't feel like asking, or didn't even realize that they didn't know something, right? That even if, right, I tell my students this, right, that if even if they are truly the only one in the room that doesn't know it, right, that p-value, well, it's very, very small, it's not zero, right? That I still want them to ask because it gives everybody else the opportunity to gauge their own understanding, right? It tests them right then. Put themselves in the moment. They're now Dr. C for the moment. How would you answer that question? Right? Do you know this? And it helps them as they're learning, right? It helps them monitor, right? Oh, I got this. I know that one. I'm not going to have to worry about studying about that as much. Or, oh, that's a place that I don't have an understanding. I need to look up that again, right? It helps them in again, gauging their understanding. All right. Jeremy Craig Prisoner would ask a question and then wouldn't move on until someone. That's true. That's true. Here's another thing I will say, it's sort of the same light about this, Megan, is I do this too, because I'm like, come on, I need you to interact, right? Again, the students come in, there are days, right? They're all tired, right? They've just had, a midterm. It's been a very busy week. And so engage them, right? Getting them moving and everything. And there's different activities, right, that we can do for that. But I will sometimes do it, be like, hey, I'm not moving on until we get an answer, right? So I need someone to think about or I do something like, hey, you're in small groups, talk with your peers first, right? Take a few minutes, talk, right? And then I'll ask the question again, right? Again, just to get them to be engaged in thinking about things. What you don't want to do, and this happens, I've seen this happens, is uh, someone asks a question, and then within 2 seconds, they answer their own question, right? Like you got to give your students time, and it can be uncomfortable, right? That cricket, that silence, right, can be uncomfortable sometimes as you're waiting for someone to answer or put up their hand, right? But it's easy to ask a question and then answer it, right, 2 seconds later. So, um, just trying to keep that in mind. Yes, they lost that hour of sleep this week. Yeah, it's fun. It's fun right now, right? Until we all adjust, right? I want my hour back also. All right. So, right. So that idea, get right, practicing metacognition, helping your students, right? They need to, again, building that trust, being transparent about what we're doing in class, those activities, right? Helping them get confidence that, okay, you know what? I am actually learning this, right? I'm actually getting this. My framework is good. It ties back to the goals and objectives that I want them to learn. And we're going to talk more about that in a minute, right? And again, they're practicing and monitoring, they're testing themselves, right? Allowing them to ask these questions, right? I'm noticing this, right? All right. And so what I've done, hopefully, in my talk so far, right, with these, with how people learn, and as well as the part at the beginning about, building trust, is that that is kind of the what and the why we set up the structure of our classes, right? Things that we want to keep in mind. So now, what are the ways, right? How? How do we do this? How do we set it up to help our students? And so this is where we need to dive into the idea of assessments. And so many folks are familiar with the summative assessment, right? We're assessing the learning, right? It's at the end, right? So that is that exam, that final paper, the presentation, right? You did lots of stuff, right? And this is at the end. And what I want to encourage you is to, like, those things are good, right? Nothing wrong with having those assessments, but we want to also have formative assessments, right? The assessment for learning. This is happening during class, during the activities that the students are learning. And so I'm listing a couple there, but there are lots of different ways, and I'm going to go through that um, in a few minutes, but we're going to think about it from the point of view of what's called backward design. And so depending on when you may be giving a lecture, right? You get hired at a university. Of course, you're going to be doing your research, right? And then you also may be teaching. You may be handed, a course, right? And the previous instructor, right? They give you all of the materials, and that's great, right? Or you might be having to develop your own, right? And the kind of classic standard way is you choose the textbook, you write the syllabus, right? You get those lectures, you get your PowerPoints, write exams, right? Again, that's all about you. It's in the order that you're doing things. But what I want to encourage you to do is instead is be the scientist that you are, right? It's backward design. This is what you do on a daily basis with your science, right? I want you to think about what are those learning goals. Part of that is that may already be established in the class, right? Like how does this class, what are the things that the students need to learn, the learning objectives, right? That's part of that curriculum, right? How does this class fit into the broader context of that degree? Or how does this lecture fit into the broader context of this course? All right. We then design those assessments, and then we think about the activities. And this is student learning or student centered, excuse me. And the one thing that I want to help you avoid is many folks, when they start doing this, they skip the assessment. They want to go from, okay, I want students to learn this, and then they're like, and I really want to try this activity. They jump right to activity and they don't think about the assessment side, right? That activity might not be the best way for you. It may be cool, it may be fun, but it may not be the best way for you to assess what your students are learning, as well as for the students to understand and figure out, are they learning, right? And so just as you are in the lab, right? Backward design is what we do in our teaching, right? This is the idea of scientific teaching, right? I imagine that no one walked into the lab this morning or will later this afternoon and said, I feel like using the microscope, right? Like I imagine you just don't do that, right? Because one, you might not even have a microscope in your lab, right? Like that's not the right tool. That's not the right activity, right? Or assessment, right? Like it's not going to be able to help you answer the question. You instead, as a scientist, right? You do this method. You do that scientific method, right? You have a problem or a question or a hypothesis, and you design that test experiment, right? And then you do it. You collect those data. And so we do the same thing in our classes, right? What do we want students to know, right? We're going to go a little bit more into this in a minute, right? How do you know if they get there? And then what is it that they're going to do to show you that? Right. And so with backward design, again, we're going to think about our goals and outcomes, right? Our objectives, thinking about those assessments, and then what we're going to do, right? But this is what the students are going to do, right? In the order they do something, they're going to assess themselves as well as you assessing them, right? As they're doing it, and then to know that they're achieving, right? The outcomes that you would like. And so this concept of learning goals versus learning outcomes or objectives, right? Learning goals are what will the students learn versus what will the students be able to do? And this is kind of subtle, right? But as you look at as you look at these two columns, A, B, and C, which one do you feel is easier to assess? Feel free to write in the chat. Is it the left column or the right column? Which one's easier for you to figure out if students are able to do it? Mhm. Everyone's voting right or for the right, right? As again, we look at those verbs, right? And that is our differences here, right? Our learning goals are these broad goals that are not measurable, right? How do you measure if someone understands, right? What's the the value, the parameter that, how do you put a number to that, if you will, right? Like how do you do that? You can't, right? Like it's not, at least it's not easy, right? So those learning goals are those big umbrella goals, right? Our learning goal for today was how to structure a lecture, right? How to understand how to do that, right? Our outcomes, our objectives are those verbs, right? You can do something that students will show how they can predict, or they can interpret a graph, right? Or explain, right? And so this is where, again, go back to Bloom's, right? These are those action verbs. These are things that students can show you, based on the activity, right? Based on the assessment, they can show you that they can do these verbs, right? And in the situation where, again, you may be handed something, right? Or something that you've done previously, right? Like I'm going to call it activating class materials, right? Things that, the thing about giving a lecture, that again, there's nothing wrong with lecturing, right? Again, there's place for lecture, but I will tell you that we want to throw in some other things, right? That you don't have to start over, right? It is not starting from scratch, right? And this is just a decision tree type diagram, right? Which gives you ideas about, again, how does the material, right? Does it work within our learning objective, right? It's easy to go off on tangents. There's some really cool things in biology, and my students will ask questions, and I don't, unfortunately, a lot of times have the time to go into those cool things that they're thinking about at that moment, right? So I remind them that what our learning objective is for the day, right? That not that I want to push off and say we can't talk about it, but that we can talk about that like after class or come to office hours, right? That's not because I need to be cognizant, right, of like what am I trying to achieve for the class that day, right? And if I have the time, right, there are ways to work that in, right? There are ways in the different activities, right, to work in that time for discussion, right? For those, you call it spitballing or just, crazy ideas of just, exploration, right, of whatever that topic might be. All right. So your assessment, excuse me, must align with your learning goals and objectives. Again, that idea that I said earlier about alignment versus misalignment, right? The idea that if I'm spending my time in class talking about amino acids, right, and how, I'm talking about their chemistry and, if you change this and all of that, but then on the exam, I don't even mention that. Again, I lose trust with my students. Right? They're going to come to class and going to be like, well, that wasn't a fair exam, right? I studied the things that you seem to think was important, right? But that wasn't important in the assessment. So remembering to align those things and again, doesn't water down anything, right? I'm not just because I can be fully transparent about, I want you to be able to draw serine, right? Like I can be fully transparent about that. I may or may not ask you to draw serine, right? But I can be transparent about that so that they know I want them to be able to do that, right? And I can design an exam question where I can tell them, right, basically, like, well, if you can draw serine, then if you change this aspect, they can draw that too, right? There are ways, again, that I can still test, right, that knowledge. So this is a kind of table that you can use to set up each of these different things that are important for a given topic. right? So our learning goal, right? What will students know or understand, right? What is it that I want them to know? I want them to be able to understand the transfer of information from DNA to proteins. So right? And again, I can't measure understand, right? The things that I can measure, right, is that they can predict changes in an amino acid sequence caused by a mutation, right? That is something that I can give them a situation and they should be able to predict, right? That is the doing that they should be able to do, right? So my assessment, right, the summative, the exam question, right, they can demonstrate this is that if I give them a new sequence that results from a mutation, right, they can predict that, right? They can show me where that change is. What I can do in class, right, is give them these sequences and to ask them, can you identify the reading frame? Right? Based on the reading frame, now you're looking at that codon table, right? What's changed from what to what, right? These are demonstratable, right? Measurable things that the students can show me, but they also can show each other and they're showing themselves. All right. That's the thing is thinking about again those blooms level. I'm gonna go back to my blooms. I'll harp on blooms, right? Because this again is what is the level that you want your students to know, right? And it's never going to be that you want always evaluation, like you always want these high. You want a mix, right? There are going to be some things that you just need them to know and understand, right? And there are going to be other things where they take that knowledge and apply it, right? Or synthesize or evaluate. So here's an example of, I call it fundamental knowledge. This is my freshman lecture. This is lecture 5 on DNA. And I put in blue here, right? Those are my action verbs. All right. I want them to be able to explain. I want them to be able to diagram, describe, recognize. Right. And again, same thing with alignment. Right. So if I ask them, I just want you to recognize the structure. Right. If I put a structure of adenine, I want you to be able to tell me it's adenine. Right. It's not fair for me then to ask them to draw. Right. Because that's asking more. That's a misalignment. So I need to be transparent again, and I am, right? They get this every one of my lectures, they get the course objectives or the lecture objectives of the day. This helps them know again what is the level of blooms that I want them to know. It also helps them as we talk about things, what things to look for. Here are the things that I care about. Here are the things I'm going to assess them on. All right. I take all of my fundamental knowledge, and this is how I write my exam. I come up with an exam question and I go back through my fundamental knowledge and go, okay, that covers this one and that one. I check them off my list, right? Then I come up with another question and I check off this list and that one, right? I check them off my list. And what that does is not only am I being true to what I want my students to know, it also helps me not overemphasize something in my lecture, right? If my exam is over 5 lectures, I don't want 80% of my exam to be on the first lecture, right? Because I'm asking them to learn a lot of stuff, right? I want them to know a lot of different things. So I need to be cognizant that I keep everything, right, as even as I can, right, with the things that I'm asking them to learn. Right. So getting back to this idea of, right, so writing an exam, right, that's a topic for another day. Right? Right. There's lots of things you can think about with that, right? But I want to talk more about those formative assessments, right? What are the things that we can do during class, right? Because again, those formative assessments are things that help students figure out, do I know this, right? Do I have a good understanding? Is my framework good, right? It allows students to monitor that using by the feedback that they're getting. It helps them retrieve, right? If I'm asking things right in class, if they're doing the stuff, then they're retrieving information. That's that testing effect, right? And it's real time, right? It helps me, right? It's easy. I've been in classes where I'm like, ooh, this is just not working, right? We're going to modify. We're going to change that up next time, right? Or change it up and at the moment, right? And that of course comes with practice, right? And exposure. So I'm going to go through lots of different types of examples, just give you ideas, right? So they'll go back to that whole ask, don't tell, right? For content, there's lots of ways to do, right? There are some classes have the technology with clickers, right? Or polls, right? We did a poll here, right? That keeps you engaged. I'm asking a question. It's anonymous, right? I don't know what you answered. I don't know if you told me Kathy, Trissa. I don't know who told me Michael. I don't know who you are, right? But but it helps me see where's the class, right? It helps, right? Because I can reveal the answer afterwards, right? How is everyone doing here? Right? Is this something that I can now move on? Right? Everyone, the great majority of the individuals in the class are getting this, so I can move on to the next topic, or we need to keep visiting this, right? Something is not getting across the way that I would like it to, right? And there's lots of ways to do it anonymously, like say through polls. There's ways to do it by raise of hands, right? There's lots of versions of this. I can do it where there's not necessarily an answer, right, or a correct answer, right? What, in your opinion, is the role of assessment, right? I can do what's called a minute paper or a minute question. I could ask you to write, right, and on a sometimes I do this on a note card. So that also helps them, like they can't tell me a novel. They can only tell me so much in a minute's time, right? What's the muddiest point from today's lecture? What's the one thing? What's your top thing that you didn't understand today? Right? I can collect those at the end of class. I can go through them and say, you know what? Half the class is still not getting amino acid structures. Okay, I know what I could try to work on that next. How are the ways that I can now in the next lecture work that back in, right? Or make sure I hit that at the review session, right? Right. And again, it's allowing the students to tell me what's going on, but it's also helping them, right? It's helping them in their metacognition, right? What is it that they don't understand, right? Similar, right? This is a reflection. It's a bit longer than the minute question, right? I have this usually as an assignment where after several lectures, I say, what's the most interesting concept that you've learned about so far, and how does it relate to something in your life? Right. So they're making those connections. They tell me what's important to them, right? How they're making connections with the material, right? So how it impacts their own thoughts, right? Again, I can ask things about what's the implications for society, right? If that's the direction I want to go. There's a lot of different yeah, helps avoid someone put in chat, right? Or Vicky did. Yeah, helps avoid the use of AI, right? Doing all this stuff in class helps me get away from AI, right? But it also makes them personal, right? Most students aren't going to spend the time to ask AI, so what am I thinking about, right? Or which concept, like they're going to tell me, right? Because again, they're invested in their learning, right? If I build that trust, if I build this in a way, right, to engage them, they're going to tell me how their connection. And I learn all kinds of things about my students in amazing ways, right? That I can remember a time when I had a student who we were talking about the bubble boy, right? The David, right, who was here in the med center, right, many years ago, who, right, he lived in a bubble, right, because of his immune system or lack of immune system, right? And this student talked about how she had never thought about just the simple pleasure of going outside and touching grass. And it was just a connection. It just made it real to her that this was something she could so easily do and he couldn't. And so it can be a powerful way of allowing students to express themselves and think about what the content means to them. Think pair shares is one of my favorite, right? Think pair shares is I could ask this very open-ended question: which eukaryotic organelle is the most important? I ask you to think about that for the next 30 seconds. Then I ask you to pair up with your neighbor in the room, right? Talk about what you think the organelle should be, right? And then we have the call out back to the rest of the class, right? And again, so allow students in a very low stakes manner, right? Not everyone has to tell me the answer, right? But in a very low stakes manner, it's okay for them to say, I don't know, to their peer, right? I might not know that, and that's okay. But they feel more comfortable talking to their peer because their peer may also say, oh, I don't know either, right? It helps with that. Having students create the lecture with you, right? They get a topic. Next class, you're going to create the first slide, right? To help instruct us. And then we go into a discussion, right? Again, helping them know what they know, helping, again, lots of interaction with each other. And again, students teach each other's in ways that I don't reach them in the same way, right? I reach them in other ways. The jigsaw, right? There could be a problem where each member of the team, right, has a different piece of the puzzle and they have to each figure out their own part and then they come together to share it, right? And collectively they see how their pieces work. Like this works really well for something like a enzyme pathway, right? Each member of the team gets a different enzyme in that pathway, and they have to figure out different things about that protein, right? And then they got to put themselves in order, right? And that way it helps them as a group figure out that pathway. The debate's fun, right? You got to set some rules, of course, right? But it can be a fun thing. I can go back to that question I asked. Have a debate on which organelle do you think is the most important, right? People will have opinions, right? And you could also hand it out. Hey, I'm going to give your group the nucleus. I'm going to give your group the mitochondria, right? You've got a debate. You 10 minutes, right? You can research things, you can discuss things. You got to tell me why you think the nucleus is right and why you think the mitochondria, right? And then have the class vote, right? Who won that? Right? And again, they're learning and they're learning as a whole. And it's a lot of fun. Similar way, case studies, giving them real data, right? Or fictional data. Right. This is one from my class. This is from lecture 3 when we do protein purification, right? So we're talking about protein, we're talking about amino acids, those R groups, those chemistries, and how we can purify proteins. And so these are some of the questions that they get, right? So they get this case study ahead of time. So they know that when they come to class, we're going to discuss this so that they can try to figure out these things on their own. But they can also circle and go like, I just don't understand what's going on with ammonium in the hydrophobic interaction, right? And they can talk to their peers about that, right? Again, is that low stakes? Again, I may not know, right? I'm walking around the room. I may overhear someone say something, right? But I jokingly say, right, they can hide, right, from me because I'm the scary professor, right? They don't want me to know that they don't know something, right? But this is um, a good way for them to do it. Yep, I see that, Vicky. I'm almost done. I promise. A strip series, right? Have them sort each of these topics, right? I'm actually going to show you the way, right? You can. This is actually right. Create the strip series, work in pairs, have them figure out what the order is. Talk about why they did that, right? Where their misconceptions are. And again, report out to the class if needed. The concept map. This is fun, right? Here are a lot of terms. Make sense out of them. All right. Your efforts, they don't all work. It's like any experiment. You're a scientist, right? So the idea, right, that you try, you assess, you tweak, you try again, right? And that so sometimes, right, it's best to try something else, right? Know that it can negatively impact, right? But again, in the moment, right, you're able to see things. You can also ask for, you can have that anonymous survey. How was today's case study, right? Do you think it was helpful, right? Your students will let you know, or let the TAs know. So those are again, going back to our learning objectives, here are the things that we hit upon today. And that's my last slide. Not bad, 12:46. I did good.
That was awesome. Thank you so much, Jamie, for sharing such incredible tips. So I'm going to put a link to a survey in the chat. If you'll take just a minute, one of the things that we'd like to know, Jamie touched on a ton of things today to give you kind of an
Yeah.
overview of different things that you can do in your class lectures. So we would like to know what you would like to know more about. So in this survey, we give you the opportunity to share, hey, he talked about backward design. Like, I would like to know more about how that actually functions. If you'd be interested in a half day in-person workshop that Jamie would lead to kind of demonstrate to you what an in-class lecture can look like. We would love to know that from you so that we can, meet your needs. So this was our first teaching session. And so Jamie did an excellent job of kind of guiding us through how learners learn and what happens in the brain and how to take that into account when you're structuring your lectures. But we would love to know from you what else you would like to learn, because Jamie's got a whole lot of stuff that he can share with us. So
You learn a
lots
lot in
of
11 years.
yes. So
Yeah.
lots of thank yous in the chat. So thank you to everyone.
Mhm.
Yes, I will make the slides
Yeah.
available. And so I will be sending y'all an email with the slides
Mhm.
and as well as a copy of the survey, a link to the survey as well, so that you can have access to those materials. So again, thank you, Jamie, for
Yep.
taking the time out of your day and for sharing such incredible information with us. That was a really very interesting information. So it was really great. So thanks,
I just want to mention
everybody.
my emails here, djc98 at rice.edu. Feel free to email me.
Yes. Okay, everybody, have a great day. And if you are not, well, if you are on spring break, hope you're enjoying your spring break. If you are not on spring break, hope you enjoy it next week. If you don't get a spring break because you're a postdoc, I'm really sorry. I hope that you still take some time this afternoon to, kind of process what you've learned and, just kind of absorb all the different things that Jamie talked
Mhm.
about. So, yes, so
A reflection.
a reflection. You can do
There
a
you
one
go.
minute reflection. So,
Absolutely.
yes, so great tips. Okay, everybody, have a great afternoon. Thank you for joining us.
And 10 minutes before class.
I know,
Woo.
I know. Thank you, Jamie. That was incredible. You
Yep.
touched on some really important concepts that are
Yeah.
all part of the basis of like why we do what we do and how we
Hmm.
do it. So, yeah, and even
Yeah.
the Ebbinghouse's forgetting curve. I loved it when somebody threw that into
Yeah.
the chat. So the curve of forgetting. I always thought
Yeah.
that sounded a little bit like something off of SNL, like there was the cone of silence. And
The
so
call
this
of
is the
silence. Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
this
Yes.
is the
Yes.
curve of forgetting. So yeah, throwing in a little Ebbinghaus is always fun. So well, thank you, Jamie. Head off to
Yep.
class. We will
Yep.
talk later and
Yep.
just really appreciate it. It was fantastic.
It was
Yeah,
fun.
thank you, Jamie. I really appreciate the fact that you didn't really talk down to them either. I mean, I
Hmm.
think you really,
The same as my
really,
students. I was like, I don't know everything.
yeah, but you really captured them as to exactly where they are and what they need. And
Hmm.
so, we really appreciate it. Look forward to future
Yep. No, it'd be
sessions like
fun.
this.
Yeah.
It's true. I learned a lot too, and it was great.
So you can
Yeah,
give a lecture now.
we loved it throughout the terms, formative and summative. So
Yeah.
Yep.
that was great. Yeah,
Okay,
appreciate it
thanks,
Okay.
very much.
Jamie. Have a great
Yep.
Bye.
afternoon and a
You
great
too.
spring break. Okay,
You
bye-bye.
too.